The story goes like this. Earth is captured by a techno-capital singularity as Renaissance rationalization and oceanic navigation lock into commoditization takeoff. Logistically accelerating techno-economic interactivity crumbles social order in auto-sophisticating machine runaway. As markets learn to manufacture intelligence, politics modernizes, upgrades paranoia, and tries to get a grip. It goes on like this with wonderful phrases such as nanospasm and nothing human makes it out of the near future.
Right.
So some weeks ago, I hosted an event we called the Nick Land Acknowledgement. So Nick Land has been a big influence on me for the last 10 years, I guess, from reading his blog Xenosystems and of course such wonderful texts as Meltdown, which we just heard from. And it was very interesting to see the kind of changes in his thought and in the world around him, the ways in which he's been prophetic and the ways in which things have updated. And so I wanted to bring on my colleague DC Posch, a fellow student and reader of Nick Land, to discuss this prophetic cyberpunk text,
Yes.
Meltdown, and some samplings of Xenosystems and more recent happenings. So DC,
Great. Glad to be here.
yeah, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming. I'm your host, Wolf Tivy. DC Posch is a fellow San Franciscan and comrade in our various activities here. So we read Meltdown some weeks ago in our book club. We've been reading Xenosystems again. These are works that you read many times.
Yeah.
So why don't you give us your impression of the overall thing? I mean, you I think suggested that we read Meltdown in the first place. So
Right.
so how do you see the importance of this text?
Well, I mean, I think the really fun thing about Nick Land is that he's a really out there, really crazy person, right? Who gets less crazy with every passing year.
Yes.
And you read Meltdown, and it's from 1994, and it's written in this very sort of self-consciously esoteric and absurd and extreme style.
This was a lecture he gave in
Yes.
person.
Yes. And, you know, he's on CCRU and he's talking about, like the world being dissolved in like the acid vat of techno-capital and all of this.
Yeah.
And
Back in
then-
the 90s, people were
Exactly.
listening to Nirvana.
exactly. And I mean, you reread it now and it still feels pretty nuts, but much less so than when it was written.
Yeah.
And this just makes it inherently interesting. And yeah, I mean, I think we can explore some of that and what that feels like right now versus there's still all of these like deep eschatology questions about the end of the world and what this is all heading towards versus there's like fun practical questions of like what's the next 10 years like.
Yeah.
What can we
So
say?
I think most appropriately, we should start with kind of an
Yeah.
overview of the text as we read it.
Yes.
So Meltdown is a short essay. It was delivered as a lecture.
Yep.
It's basically telling the story. You know, the story goes like this, right? It's telling the
Right.
story of what is happening to mankind for the past few
Yep.
hundred years as we move towards the singularity. I think 1994, like this is, if I'm not mistaken, that might be the same year that Werner Vinge kind of coined one of the major formulations of the idea of the singularity.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that's been kind of underground in science fiction circles for a long time. The idea being, of course, that artificial intelligence can further improve itself, rapidly outpace
Yep.
everything that humanity is, and ultimately replace us as the kind of driving force of history. So this is this idea that's been around since the very idea of computers was formulated, in the 50s and then again in the 60s. Various thinkers have proposed this idea that the machines will take off. Nick Land, the author of this, marries that to the Marxist tradition of thinking about capitalism, and what capital does. He divorces the Marxist tradition from kind of thinking that it will reach any kind of steady state or that there's some kind of eschatological, communist end times. And he says, what if it just keeps going? And this is sort of the accelerationist theory within that. And so this document is basically describing what does it look like for the world to be kind of dissolved by this process. And another key thesis that he has, which I think is really interesting and important, and distinct from even still guys like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who imagine a much more singular, agentic kind of intelligence. Nick Land imagines artificial intelligence take off as this kind of ambient process that's almost, in his terms, invading from the future, where the whole world is kind of coming apart at once, dissolving into this larger future artificially intelligent space, as it's sometimes called. So Meltdown is the story of that. So
yeah, I mean, like you say, the Marxist version of capitalism, I think also the capitalist version of capitalism. Like I view Land as like I think one way to read him is as just like a successor to Adam Smith.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, he would definitely appreciate that characterization. He's especially these days, he's really into the Anglo-Protestant tradition of thought, which Adam Smith obviously is highly cited within.
Well, here's what I mean by that. So, Adam Smith has this nice metaphor of the invisible hand, and it describes basically, capitalism as a kind of force that's bigger than any of us, that's sort of reaching down and putting everyone into his, quasi-optimally allocated place. Yeah. And he has all of these wonderful examples of like the pencil factory and the pin factory and whatnot. And you could imagine a world that just runs very smoothly, all watched over by the invisible hand, in the absence of technological invention. So it's like technology is static. No one's really making any, non-incremental progress on anything. However, all of the factories run really smoothly, and all of the bakeries run really smoothly, and all of the farms run really smoothly, and this is because the invisible hand is doing its magic. Yeah, it's allocating things in equilibrium. Exactly. Yeah. And I think, from writing from like inside the 1700s, like the pace of technological invention doesn't look very fast. It makes sense. It's like, okay, the major thing that's happening, if you're looking at the world through the lens of the 1700s, is the rise and fall of empires as their institutions improve or as their people improve. So he's writing, addressing that, saying, well, look here, if we have these institutions, we'll get better results. Yes. But in a sort of steady state way, right? Yes. If we have high level of institutional adoption of these capitalist kind of ways of being, then we'll be a wealthy nation. Right. And Nick Land is sort of proposing and he's taking it this big step further. It's like, yes, there's an invisible hand, but it's reaching from the future and yoinking you. Yeah. And the way that it does this is that, capitalism is this competitive process that mirrors evolution by natural selection in a bunch of ways. Right. It's a Darwinist process. In the and just like evolution by natural selection, it's like not some like static set of species. Like new things. New things are being invented all the time. And so this becomes like a competitive process where it's like, okay. And an innovative process. Totally. I think one like concrete example of this that's people love to like talk about is just Moore's law, where like once that pattern was set, in the 80s, early 90s, whenever, actually even a little bit longer than that before that. It was identified in the 70s, I think. I think it might have even been the late 60s. Don't quote me on that. I think it was the 70s, but but we'd have to look up the numbers. By the 80s, 90s, it became competitive. Yeah. It became all of these organizations in and around semiconductor world were trying to basically meet this bar that was an exponential bar. Right. And so it's like that version of the invisible hand looks very different than the cute, nice Simon Saris like allocating everyone to their spot in the pencil factory or the farm version. Well, let's not harsh on our boy Simon, but I'm not. But the New England world, the New England world. But you know what I'm saying? Frozen things. It looks more scary to us from
Yeah,
that angle.
and so Nick Land obviously places himself
Yeah.
in the Whig tradition, which is the
Yes.
tradition that sees some kind of progress, linear progress towards end times.
Yeah.
You know, these days he really emphasizes that religious heritage actually
Yeah.
of what he's doing. At the time of Meltdown, he's not emphasizing it at all.
Yeah.
It's purely economic, right?
Yeah.
And even, I mean, we also, in preparing for this, we read some key works in Xenosystems, like Hellbaked in particular was one that we were looking at. And even there, reading it, it's like, I'm struck now by how little of the sort of ecstatic religious fervor is present in his work even then.
Yep.
And that's only 10 years ago. And how it's evolved since then, you know, on Twitter and so on, is that he's gotten much more enthusiastically religious about the whole thing,
Right.
which is very interesting. But yeah, so he's kind of taking this Marxist tradition, he's taking this Anglo-Whig tradition, and he's taking the kind of science fiction, AI speculation traditions, and he's welding them together as this new cosmic story of what's actually happening to the world, and putting it in this extremely vivid terms of kind of like you know, the relapse into bacterial sex, like this is kind of the communist idea of like all that is solid shall be melted into thin air, right? And it's this meltdown process of everything being melted down in that way, and kind of vividly describing what that will feel like from the inside as projected through like 1990s cyberpunk kind of stuff.
He was writing Meltdown, you know what, just like 2 or 3 years after Snow Crash, and a few years after Neuromancer. Like he was like in this
he's right on the cutting edge at the time
of cyberpunk.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, of course, is that he remains right on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
Like I don't think there is any edge that's cutting it closer to what's going on than the things Nick Land is talking about now, and it's interesting to see how it's all evolved. And so I want to, I guess, like, okay, let's dwell for a minute on the actual substantive claims of Meltdown.
Yep.
So in particular, the one that's always getting quoted, nothing human makes it out of the near future.
Yeah.
Some people think it's metaphorical, some people take it very literally.
Yep.
And you know, it's definitely one of the bolder statements in the whole thing. And I think, you know, this is meant, I think, literally, in the sense of like we're looking at the takeoff of machine intelligence, of the capital means we use to accomplish things, pulling a means ends reversal and becoming the main story, to the point where the human can kind of be discarded through this iterative process, but at some point there's just nothing left of the human as we know it. There's only this machine runaway process. And that's the key kind of prophetic claim that I think, you know, it even predates Yudkowsky, right? And Yudkowsky's doomerism about AI. Yudkowsky writes in 1996, which is 2 years after this.
You know what it reminds me of? There's a long history of, you know, I think in religion of you have an initial prophet of some kind who kind of says something that's, you know, mythopoetic, and then you have people who come in after this person who take it extremely literally and go on like crazy fatwas on their over literal interpretation of the thing. You know, maybe that's what happened here. I don't know.
I mean, the interesting thing is I don't think Yudkowsky ever directly responded to or read Nick Land.
Right.
And that's an interesting thing. And I think only somewhat more recently in the last few years have the followers of Yudkowsky started engaging with Nick Land.
Right.
But, and I've been on both sides of that. But 1996, Eliezer Yudkowsky, 16-year-old kid, writes Staring into the Singularity, basically saying, like, we've got to do this. This is the ultimate accelerationist text if you read it. That's
hilarious.
It's like, we've got to go straight into the singularity. It's going to be more than anyone can imagine. You know, it's going to solve all problems. It's going to be way smarter than us and therefore able to solve all problems.
Yes.
And
16-year-old Greta writes about how we need to mine all of the coal in the world.
Yeah, exactly. No. By 2003, he realizes he's wrong. and totally reconstructs himself. He says, I disavow that person. I am no longer that person.
Yes.
Actually, this is completely crazy. It's
Yes.
going to kill us all.
He becomes a born again.
And the interesting thing about Nick Land is that Nick Land represents both of those theses.
Yep.
Right? It's both, let's go into the future, and it's going to kill us all.
Yeah.
And so, I think Yudkowsky is actually an interesting foil here. So he spends the next 15 years, basically, since 2003, trying to kind of specify the version of the singularity that can turn into kind of global coordination, lockdown of the meltdown process to prevent it from dissolving everything that is solid and everything that we love.
Right.
And that mission, in my estimation, they haven't quite admitted, not all of them have admitted it, but in my estimation, that mission failed. They were unable to create the mathematical and philosophical foundations for how that could even work. And that's an interesting point, again, where Nick Land has been vindicated, is that through his work in Xenosystems and implicitly in Meltdown, it is not possible, in his view, to arrest this process or control this process. The process is escape from control. That is the whole picture. And
and I mean, to be honest, like, I think you'd have to dig really hard in the history of technology to find cases of people successfully stopping one from being invented in the first place, or you know, exercising a lot of sort of affirmative top-down control over how one turns out as it's being invented.
Yeah, and or shutting it down, shutting it down once it exists. I mean, and we've been debating this point somewhat recently over the question of like, is it possible to shut down AI at the current time?
Yes.
And the salient example that I brought up is as a refutation that it can never be done is, well, the Germans have in fact shut off all their nuclear power.
Yeah.
They went up in a big exponential growth. Then they flatlined for a while, and then they shut it all off for some inscrutable German reason.
Yes.
And
or Russian
and
or Chinese reason.
And or enemy action.
But that worked out great for them.
You know, it's debatable whether that lesson generalizes. You know, Germany's not entirely a sovereign country.
Totally.
Maybe it's enemy action. Maybe, you know, it's.
I think though, you know, regardless of the reason why they did it, you know, it's worth noting how totally ineffectual it is. You know, China right now is building a new nuclear plant, and I forget whether it's every 3 months or every 6.
Yeah, China's building more nuclear. China's building more nuclear plants than Germany can shut down. Basically, that's the way it is.
It's so funny. It's like, you know, the German Green Party managed to get the nuclear plants shut down. Yeah, and then, you know, there was that famous Twitter post. It was those two, you know, like childless older ladies being like, you know what feels good is shutting down your last nuclear plant. I'm like, all right, you know, it's tough spot to be. And locally in Germany, it backfired directly in the sense that Germany ended up using a lot more coal. And so they backslid a bunch on their CO2 goals that had previously been the only thing that Green Party would talk about.
Right.
And even that is completely drowned in the noise. If you look at like global CO2, you know, it's completely dominated by countries that are actually doing things, not by countries that are like choosing stagnation.
That are failing to do things.
And
this is a big part of the Nick Land accelerationist meltdown, escape from control thesis, is that, you know, while you yourself might be able to commit suicide, the other guy won't necessarily do it. And in fact, whatever lineage chooses not to commit suicide will become the future. And so there's
not
always
going to drink the Kool-Aid.
Right. There's always this kind of proliferating escape out the side of the asymmetry between life and unlife.
Right.
And this is the foundational kind of projection of Nick Land's work is looking at that asymmetry, especially in the area of intelligence, and kind of projecting it forward. What you get is this total meltdown process, this total dissolution. Nothing is solid except the laws of nature. And that's
so. One thing about that, though, you know, I mean, like maybe I'm just misinterpreting or misunderstanding here, but I'm pretty confident that when he says nothing human makes it out of the near future, that he does mean that metaphorically, at least in the sense that, like it's not knowable. And I think his most interesting answer that he gave at least to me the most interesting one at the Nick Land acknowledgement is someone asked him what doom looks like, and he said that's idolatry.
Yeah, it's idolatry to try to answer the question too literally.
Yeah. You're trying to basically paint the shape of the unseeable. You're trying to like ask sort of detailed fact questions about the unknowable.
Yeah.
You have to just trust the plan. And so, the way I view it is like, nothing human makes it out in the sense that the things that are going to be escaping are going to be maybe dominated by machine intelligence. There's a lot of people who
and
sort of think
certainly different in kind from us.
Yes.
Like we are inherently this transitional form. We've been around for depending who you ask, like several thousand years to several 100,000 years to several million years. But it's certainly, if you look at the big picture history of life, we're some kind of crazy takeoff hockey stick, and we're halfway up. We should not expect to last.
Exactly, and at the same time, like I don't think it means anything nearly as literal as like like the Skynet zapper mosquito zapper bots will go and find every last one of us. Like there's versions of Doom that are actually like very pleasant for us and our successors.
Yeah, well, I mean, to put it crudely, the goon doom, but
okay, there's that one. That's the Brave New World ending.
Yeah.
There's National Park Earth. There's Zoo Earth, which is a little bit less optimistic, But I think this idea of like fundamentally we don't really know. I mean, this is like kind of like basic observation, but it's different from previous things. You could imagine like someone saying, "Oh, we just invented the railroad," and if someone was really like far-seeing and clever, maybe they could make some interesting predictions about what that leads to. Or
for example, Marx kind of projecting like, the capitalist process eventually leads to the automation of all labor or something utopia.
Totally. And you can say, we just invented gunpowder. Maybe someone can like imagine, like close their eyes and think really hard, and they can imagine trench warfare from having seen the first bit of gunpowder go off. But like, inventing intelligence, I mean, that's a different category of thing that's inherently less predictable. And so like,
it's inherently less predictable, and sort of in some way all you can do is kind of bound it in the sort of relatively harder natural laws, thermodynamics, evolution, competition, economics, survival. And that's what Land is going on, is saying we can't really predict what this thing's going to look like internally, and we can't bound what it's going to look like internally. Like this is where he differs from Yudkowsky, right? He thinks it's not possible to bound it internally, which means that it's going to run up into those physical limits, which and basically outcompete anything that isn't running into those physical limits.
There's a lot of people in the like sort of more AI safetyist world that are very smart in some sense, that have like, maybe like IQ points on both of us.
Yes.
But I've yet to hear any of them like really convincingly say like what it is they're actually intending to do. And it does feel like it really rhymes with like a lot of, the classic hubris mythology stories about flying too close to the sun and whatnot. It's like, we're going to make this thing that is smarter than us, but we're going to first get a bunch of our smartest, guys to go and do a bunch of blackboard math at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, and then we're going to figure out how to like, imprison the really smart thing and make it follow our rules. Like, I don't know. That doesn't seem like
I mean,
it's
of course,
happen.
They wouldn't quite describe it that way. They would describe it as like giving it stable agent foundations so that it's able to reliably follow its actual goal system, which we're going to give it, some version of our goal system or some extrapolation of our goal system. But like effectively, there's two big factions within the, let's call them the doomers or the AI safety people. Faction number one is what you said, which is the friendly AI faction, or variously called AI safety, but which is just a less honest framing of the whole thing. But basically, they want to build the AI that's actually going to take over the future and take over the world, and is going to have some stable goal system, contra to Nick Land's kind of diagnosis of the situation. Faction number 2 is the people who think that's too hard. We have to just stop building AI. We need a global pause on AI development. Which is also looks extremely difficult, and Land would say almost for the same reason, which is that the thing cannot be contained once it's going. And
number 3 is the actual Land people who are like,
and this
yes,
is,
unknowable, yes, accelerate.
And this is maybe what I found a little bit annoying. I have in my history hung out with a lot of the AI safety people. I've donated to the AI safety people. I've tried to collaborate with the AI safety people. And until it sort of became clear that that line of thinking could not actually lead anywhere. And this has been my engagement with Nick Land over the years, has been sort of realizing that he's right and they're wrong. And what frustrates me is people don't take his work seriously enough as the cutting edge. And it actually is the cutting edge. And the things he's engaging with now, and maybe, and before we get to even what he's engaging with now, we should also like fast forward from Meltdown to 10 years ago, Xenosystems, which was his blog, kind of further elaborating his whole thesis within the context of what was called neo-reaction, which was this sort of intellectual movement born out of the work of Mencius Moldbug, we now know as Curtis Yarvin. And basically connecting that to these bigger questions of techno-capital acceleration. And what he started doing there, obviously further elaborating the ideas of Meltdown and things like Hell Baked, where he kind of gives a theoretical foundation. It's like generalized social Darwinism. We live in a Darwinist world. Everything is competition. Everything that is good comes about through this competitive process, which at the time he's describing in horrorist terms.
Everything good comes from hell.
Everything good comes from hell. And if everything, at the end of the essay, he basically concludes with, if everything goes well, which it surely won't, all that we have to promise is eternal hell. And he says, but it'll probably be worse. So, I mean, that's his attitude at the time. He's sort of playing with this horrorist framing, which interestingly has dissolved over the last 10 years. He's much more optimistic now, though I don't think saying anything different. But what he starts to do at the time in Xenosystems is engage with 2 other strains of thought.
He moved. He's the bus meme. He moved from the wall side of the bus to like the lovely vista side of the bus. He's looking out the window now.
He's fundamentally on the same bus. So the other 2 strains of thought that he's starting to bring into his schema, besides what he calls techno-commercialism, which is kind of what he's working on with Meltdown. Meltdown is very much a techno-commercialist kind of straight understanding of the future. Then he brings in ethno-nationalism and what he calls theonomy, or what we might call theocracy or religious thought, theological thought. And he sees himself as, in an unstable alliance at the time, and an unstable alliance with these strains of thought. And it was sort of this like weird tension of like, well, we're all kind of here for Curtis Yarvin's ideas and for Nick Land's ideas and for the questions of the future, but we don't know, are we coming at this from like a ethnic or racialist stance? Are we coming at this from a religious stance? And it's all about like responding to modernity as a religious phenomenon or a religious failure? Or are we coming at this from a techno-commercial stance, responding to democracy and the degenerative ratchet in modern society as a problem for technology and progress?
Versus
and sort of
now you see like Land posting about Restore Britain every day.
And so the interesting thing is that at the time these were definitely separate. He's definitely coming at it from a techno-commercialist lens. Now he has integrated the other 2 into his thought. In particular, so at the time the religious thing was much more Catholic. It was the so-called trad Catholics were kind of very present at that time. There was a big moment of trad Catholicism, latter half of the 2010s, early 2020s. But Nick Land now has been explicitly championing this worldview that he's been developing as a continuation of the Anglo-Protestant tradition, very much against the kind of Catholic tradition, and it's the invisible hand Protestantism.
Let me give you a version of that, right?
Yeah, go for it.
I think this is why, like, I feel like he's like a spiritual successor to Adam Smith, right?
Right.
There's this idea that exists in a lot of Catholic societies, but in a lot of other societies as well, to an even greater degree, honestly, of you could call it like sort of like patrimony, right? Like authority flows from the top down, resource allocation flows from the top down.
There's some kind of fixed social order.
If you have your hacienda by the grace of the king has his kingship by the grace of God and whatever, and like it kind of like flows down in this pyramidal fashion. Versus the Adam Smith idea is more of a cellular automaton. It's like you have a bunch of agents that are out there that are each pursuing the divine in their own way. It's the Protestant idea. And they're each pursuing commercial gain in their own way. And it all somehow adds up to this greater whole. And then if you add, accelerating technological progress to that, then you have something that's already very close to Landianism, I think.
Right. Yeah, and if you place him in that tradition, you have like, I think Newton, Adam Smith, Darwin, and Land. Like those are four figures that I would name as being on a line, kind of religiously almost. And this is what he's now developing. At the event, he was calling it Gnostic Calvinism, which referring to basically the simulation hypothesis as a variant of Gnosticism, and the kind of doom thesis, the AI doom thesis, as a variant of predestined judgment from Calvin. But
he is a professional troll. He's very good at it.
It's fun, but I think more generally he's placing it in the Anglo-Protestant tradition now, and in Xenosystems he developed the idea of Gnon, right? Nature or nature's God, which is obviously the God that Jefferson invokes in the Declaration of Independence, but basically being this theologically open-ended way of talking about the divine without trying to pin it down in what he would now call like an idolatrous kind of definitiveness, and but it's definitely a very Darwinian kind of idea of God. And so incorporating that, like he's almost developed this whole religious tradition. And so that's the way he's sort of synthesized the religious arm of the problem with this techno-commercial arm. But he's also recently been synthesizing in the ethnic arm, right? With the question of, is it possible to have this kind of society of acceleration and capitalism and freedom for individuals and all these ideas without the actual English people whose folkways that is, right? And so
he's writing all of this from an apartment in Shanghai. Let's not
forget.
Forget.
Of course, he's in Shanghai. We all live in multicultural society, so it's like there's all these wonderful ironies that he's grappling with as he works through that. But he's definitely directly thinking about the ethnic component, and like whereas I think previously he would have described the ethnic dimension, the ethno-nationalist dimension, as being odious and sort of an uneasy fellow traveler. Now I think he's directly incorporating it as like a necessary component of what it would mean to kind of have this kind of accelerating society.
Let me give you two angles on it. I mean, like there's one side, and this is sort of talk about the religious side first, right? I mean, just clearly and empirically, there's like this historical connection between a lot of, sort of accelerating progress and modernity and Northern European Protestantism. Like these things have a connection. At the same time, I think, a lot of these religious cultural tendencies, they kind of, it's like they have, two wolves on each of their two shoulders, right? Like for example, like talking about Anglo-Protestantism, a lot of the most extreme variants of woke are also direct descendants of Anglo-Protestantism.
No, and I think actually the same tradition
sort of bifurcates in this different way.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with Catholicism, right? Like you have in Catholicism, tendencies that are very, they take sort of an extreme line on the Sermon on the Mount and on the idea of the last shall be first.
This is liberation theology.
Take it very literally. There's a whole strain of Catholic socialism.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, you have men like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, right? You have people who've reconciled Catholicism with the reality of evolution and with the idea that there's an accelerating process that's going somewhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, just all of the sort of, big, beautiful, fancy, high-level philosophical stuff aside, just empirically, it's okay, the people who are currently helping migrants get to Spain and the people who did the Reconquista were both Catholic, right? These things can all just sort of go both ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Actually, the point about Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is interesting.
Yeah.
Nick Land, I wrote about this in Palladium in my article "God Hates Singletons," where I analyzed Landian thought with respect to the question of kind of whether a single AI can take over the whole future.
Right.
One of the things that I commented on in that one is the fact that Land's worldview is actually very structurally similar to Chardin's. Yeah. He's in some ways the Protestant de Chardin.
Right. That's right.
And I think they're actually independent. They certainly come from very different traditions. They're constructing a very it's not apparent at first that they're really talking about the same thing, but they're both talking about the incarnation.
They're both talking about an omega point in their two different ways.
Yeah, they're both. I mean, in particular, talking about the incarnation of God into the world, or the logos into the world through the vehicle of this kind of accelerating evolutionary process that's becoming increasingly conscious as the system develops. And so I found that to be very interesting. But I want to go back to dwelling a little bit more on kind of the strains of thought that came out of Xenosystems. And another big element of it that I have seen change in the last 10 years with Land's thought is at the time of Xenosystems, he's very much emphasizing the horror, right? The horror of the whole thing. We read Hellbake just before this.
He's gotten more optimistic.
Yeah, and it's Hellbake, everything is made in hell. We promise you eternal hell. And the whole thing is just everything's going to be destroyed. But he's sort of a little bit gleeful about it, kind of smashing your face into it a little bit. But now
it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, right? He's saying everything that is beautiful and great comes from hell, and he's referring to basically the mechanism of how evolution works.
And I think though that when he's doing that, it's almost like he's kind of drawing on a tradition of moral intuitions that are obsoleted by his actual thought. And when you propagate those sort of back through, the idea that the evolutionary process is unfathomably cruel, for example, is based on certain moral premises that I don't think actually hold up once you adopt a Landian worldview. And the whole thing actually comes to look a lot more optimistic.
And it's also just, yes, I think it also just doesn't stand up to empiricism. It's if you go, on a hike in the woods, right?
Yeah. Unless you're Werner Herzog, you're not like this.
You're
is
not
suffering.
oh
this is
wow,
terrible.
what a terrible place. All of these birds that are chirping are in hell. And yet, they're chirping as a result of evolution, right? All of these things are there for that reason, and it's beautiful.
But over at Oxford, the dour philosophers, of course, are saying we should pave over the jungle because it's all just suffering. But
I do think this connects to one thing that I do think is very important and very underexplored that we should talk about briefly, which is this. It's basically, I think, there's this moral question that's kind of at the heart of it around what should more intelligent beings do with their compatriots, whatever less intelligent being, whatever's around them, and what do they owe them, and vice versa, right?
Yes.
Which is and I think right now, honestly, there's a lot of ugliness and a lot of incoherence on this topic. You look at how we treat pigs, right?
Right.
We put them in a gestation crate. They live in this like nasty, horrible situation, surrounded by metal bars, standing in their own poo, right?
Yeah.
That's what actual hell is, by the way, not
Yeah.
like evolution out there. The wild boars are having a good time.
Yeah, mind you, of course, this is part of
Yeah.
a natural process of techno-capital acceleration, where everything is becoming commoditized
Right.
and instrumentalized. And so it's like, okay, so you have to kind of challenge, like this is the hard moral core of what land is doing, is saying like, yes, let's go look at that horror, and then let's dwell on it until we figure out like how to relate to it.
Like here's
so like I want to bring the example of the ichneumon wasp, which is something I occasionally talk about, which is
the what wasp?
The ichneumon wasp, which is Darwin brought it up as an example of a creature that no loving God could have created. Because what the ichneumon
it's like a
wasp,
botfly. It's one of these horrible little insects.
It's what the ichneumon wasp does is it lays its eggs in caterpillars, living caterpillars.
Yeah, it's
and then they grow into an adult wasp inside the caterpillar, and then eat their way out. Right. And so there's these very challenging, from a sort of naive, kind of cuddly perspective. I don't know how else to put it. Like it seems very terrible.
No, that's right.
And likewise, the pig crates. And so you have to kind of process. It's the problem of evil, right? It's like how do you process the existence of this kind of stuff in the world, and what does it mean in the larger order? Right. And the way I kind of process it, and again, like Nick Land is sort of inviting us, especially in recent years, to approach these questions theologically.
Sure.
And it's like, okay, what kind of world do we live in? We live in a world of basically uniform law and freedom, essentially. Like, we are free to act in the way we will and face the consequences of that under our own power. And this is the kind of world that whoever built this place, the simulator or God or however you want to think about it, the anthropic sort of principle, however you want to name it, whatever built this thing, built it such that the world brings forth all this beautiful stuff that we see, but it does so without fiat, right? It's not just from nothing, but without, it is all learned the hard way. Yeah. And so the whole process is kind of this learning the hard way, learning beauty and goodness and life the hard way. Yeah. And that maybe makes it, in my view, a lot more meaningful than just, God snapping his fingers and it's the Garden of Eden and the lion lies down with the lamb and nothing. Sure. And because if you trace that logic, nothing has any meaning because there's no structure of interaction to give it form, right?
The theological question of whether the Garden of Eden means that nothing has any meaning is above my pay grade. But,
so we can put that aside for now. But the point I'm getting at is what seems to have happened in Nick Land's thought and what's happened in my thought in response to Nick Land is kind of coming to appreciate that process, trusting the plan a lot more.
Trusting the plan.
And Nick Land seems to have gotten a lot more optimistic. When he came to San Francisco, people, I asked him actually, what are we doing well? What are we doing wrong here? He says I don't have any criticism. San Francisco's burning like a torch.
Yeah, it's a good line.
And then his general sense of things is very optimistic. Even with respect to human extinction and so on, he's like, maybe it will, maybe it won't. And so he's very much a plan truster now. Mm-hmm. And I find that a very interesting development through this kind of amoral cyberpunk accelerationism of Meltdown to the horrorism of Xenosystems to now his kind of more religious era where it's very optimistic actually, even though it's still talking about the same process.
I think there's something natural about it. I think there's something natural and reasonable. Basically, Land has always been someone who is more curious than judgmental, and someone who has a descriptive rather than a prescriptive attitude, right? Yes. And this is true even in the Meltdown days. Yes. He isn't we should be dissolving everything in a vat of techno-capital. He's like, no, this is what's happening. I'm here to observe. I'm David Attenborough. I'm narrating the jungle of techno-capital for you into my microphone. And so what happens to someone who has a curious and descriptive rather than prescriptive attitude when they're in their 60s? They're at peace.
Right.
You know, he's like, yeah, this is happening.
This is how it is. Yeah. Trust the plan, guys. God has it under control.
Exactly. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And you know, it's just like fundamentally a nicer way to go through life than to go through your life in the like crying Wojak, shaking your fist at it.
seething that you're not able to overcome God.
Exactly.
I mean, which is ultimately the doom of the kind
you're
of
not able to like bottle the genie and like you know whatever, like put the uranium back into the earth and whatever.
Yeah, well, this is sort of as I dwell. I actually came from the Yudkowskian tradition much more than the Landian tradition, and land kind of convinced me eventually. But in the Yudkowskian tradition, what I realized, you know, of you know bottling the genie and trying to kind of create friendly AI, I realized that what they're really trying to do is overcome God, right? And and sort of negate the sovereignty of God and like set up our perfect system that's going to make us comfortable without having to rely on any trust.
Yes.
Like we're not going to have to trust the system at all. We're not going to have to trust any plan. All we have is our own will, our own, you know, self-reflective, artificially intelligent super system. But like
I think
it amounts to trying to overthrow God, and like at the end of the day, like the end result there is realizing that you can't, and then just seething about the sovereignty of God. And it's like, it's total dead end.
And even if you could, which you can't, it would be ugly, right? Like there's this idea of like, what if we had, you know, gestation crates in both directions? We have downward facing gestation crate for the pig. We have upward facing gestation crate for this like super intelligence that we're gonna like bottle it up within inside of all these bars. Like that's not how it works. And then, you know, the reason I brought up this, or I said like, oh, I think this is like a big moral question, is I think, you know, people have really incoherent attitudes towards the less capable, right? Like there's an attitude in certain parts of SF, like, oh, these people are less capable, we have to let them do whatever they want. Like there's another attitude towards like, oh, you know, we're going to like just like maximally like abuse and squeeze every last cent out of this system of, you know, just nasty stuff. This is the sort of
the gambling app types.
And it's like, exactly, it's like, well, you know, you have to basically reject both of these things, and I think accept some concept of stewardship. Which is like, what does a national park ranger do, right? Like, they're not there to like micromanage the bison and like, you know, teach them how to like sit and spin. They're also not there to like, you know, put bison in gestation crates, because that would be like ultimate ugliness.
Yeah, and they're not there to enable the bison in any kind of vice either.
They're there to enable them in a very zoomed out and quite beautiful sense of like, hey, give them the environment within which they can thrive. And I think that's like basically what a higher intelligence like owes to you know, and I think the more that we can sort of like model that and live that and like make that a reality in our own society, the better of an example that we set for our successors.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And so I dwelled on that question a lot in Palladium 7, where we started talking about these environmental questions. When we did Palladium 7, I remember like it comes down to that. It's like, what is our relationship to the natural world around us? And you know, pulling on these kind of Landian threads, I realized, well, none of that has any future. None of this conservation or stewardship has any future if those systems serve no purpose.
Right.
And so ultimately what we have to do is understand whether and how those things serve a purpose for us.
Yes.
Whether it carries some spiritual weight or some information, it's a ritual, or it's an ecosystem that we actually rely on to have in a healthy state so that we can like have it cycling our carbon or these various other things like clean water. And like the way you have to think about it, like let's put on our optimizer hats, the sort of people that would put the pigs in crates, and say, okay, well, why shouldn't I put the pig in a crate? And you have to start thinking about the whole social organism. And this is where I have an interesting tension, I guess, with Nick Land. It's like the Meltdown thesis in particular sort of presumes the dissolution of all these larger social organisms. But I actually
don't think it's true at all.
Yeah, I think there will be these larger social organisms.
It's not true at all in the sense that, you know, just empirically, if you look at how all of the acceleration, Land identifies acceleration as something that's been going on for, you know, at a long time, right? And the tendency this entire time has been towards like higher and higher levels of organization, higher and higher levels of organized conflict, all of these things.
Right.
And so the idea that this is going to just like, suddenly reverse and turn into some like singleton
Yeah,
at the end of time doesn't make any sense.
There's no singleton and there's no bodies without organs, right?
Yes.
Like these are the sort of two poles of
Yes.
what it could be, but actually you get an incredible amount of structure, and there's going to always be an incredible amount of structure. Even if everything is overturned and dissolved, new structure will take its place. And so the question is, what is the relationship of that structure to the systems that live within it, which are somewhat independent? And it is, as you say, creating an environment in which those systems can thrive as part of a larger order that needs them.
Yeah.
And like, for example, the mitochondria, right?
Yeah.
The mitochondria, maybe at first they were in a gestation crate,
Sure.
but over time the mitochondria have been modified so that their highest fulfillment and their highest flourishing is found sitting in the cell and processing the energy in that way. And I think similarly, if we put on our Meltdown hats and think about the gestation crates, the further version of that is, well, you modify the pig into some, people were talking about, what is it, the bodyoid or something, some sort of like lab meat version where it's like a pig who doesn't have a brain or something.
That isn't suffering.
And it's not suffering because it's actually
that's
much more designed to be in that role.
Yes, exactly. And that's clearly like a less ugly way to make bacon than
right.
whatever
And I
we're
think,
currently doing.
but the thing to notice there is that by optimizing according to the nature and really going for the cutting edge, the thing in fact becomes more beautiful and less ugly.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's an interesting thesis of that's why you trust the plan.
That's why you trust the plan. But I think, and maybe this is like the other point of the disagreement. Like where I think one thing where we have like an easier problem as Christians is like we don't have to try to like justify life in terms of like what is it useful for, It's like there's an element of life isn't in itself. Living things have a spirit, and that's sort of worth and to go back to the national park example, not to harp on it too much, but they're not doing it because they want to make, bison burgers. They're not doing it because they're useful. They're doing it because they're beautiful.
Yeah, but it's part of our, let's say it's part of our larger like spiritual social order that we do
That's
this.
right. That's right.
And it's part of our commitments to each other and to the world that we want to live in. It's a garden in some way. Like this is why in the essay that I wrote for Palladium 7, I call it The Rise of the Garden Empires. Because what we're talking about here is we're actually gardening some part of the earth as part of our internal order.
Yes.
But, it's in some ways...
Yes. Yes. I think this is like the closest that you get to like heaven is some kind of like garden fractal, where you have big, very wild things like
the English idea of heaven is an English garden.
Right. You see what I'm getting at? You have like big, really wild ones that are basically just like this entire area is a nature preserve.
Yes.
And you have something like the whatever hunting grounds that's like a bit more manicured, and then you have like an actual literal garden that's like sitting behind a house.
Yeah, you have these gradations.
And all of these things, they kind of like serve their own purpose, but there's sort of a fractal of like stewardship of we're taking care of these beings, and then they're taking care of their beings, but it's in a way that isn't like too too utilitarian. Yeah,
so I think to finish the sort of the thread on how this Meltdown stuff applies.
Yeah.
It's so first of all, yes, even under the Meltdown future, like unhuman, super intelligence, we may see things like that of like ourselves even perhaps living in some garden that is now beyond our control. On the other hand, we will definitely eventually see a war within that world that overturns all of that, because there will always be churn, especially in these symbolic, spiritual, internal orders of things. And next time there's a major war, all the sort of stuff that is not needed directly for war mobilization gets thrown out. We get another arms race, piece of history, and things get more wonderful on some dimensions and less wonderful on others.
Right.
But ultimately, the plan works out for the better.
Well, we haven't bombed Yellowstone yet.
We haven't bombed or mined Yellowstone yet. I predict that it will eventually happen. But
Right.
okay, so that's all our interpretation
Yep.
of Land's work here and his
Yep,
evolution over time. But I think the challenge with this accelerationist thought has always been like, okay, great, this is totally accurate
Yep.
as a view of the world.
So now what do
now
we do?
what?
What
Now,
do we
like,
do?
how do we actually engage with this?
Yeah.
Because like one version of it is this very cheap, there's this paper, Gender Acceleration, a black paper. We should review that sometime for our audience of students here. But basically, it's like that one is this totally maximalist, throwing yourself into the absolute inhumanity and like dissolution of the future, dissolving your own gender into the machine and stuff.
Sure.
And like
I
that's
think Land even directly wrote about some of that in Meltdown. He's like, there will be
of course,
teenagers experimenting with like non-human body parts and modifying themselves in crazy ways.
Yeah,
and
so that's one view of things, and I sort of caricature, let's say, effective accelerationism, so-called, or some of the more naive accelerationists as essentially doing that. Like they're essentially just cheering on the process in a way that is self-sacrificial, which I think is incorrect.
Yeah.
And so then at the other end, we have like the doomers trying to get control of the whole process. And in the middle, we have people basically acknowledging the process and building up their own agency using its elements, recognizing that they're mortal, but trying to achieve something in the meantime anyways. And I think that golden mean is where the action is. It's like
and
this stuff does not
humility. It requires a certain level of humility. If your attitude is like, I'm gonna control the light cone by figuring out how to create the machine, like that's not
humble at all, and it's incorrect.
And it's incorrect. If your attitude is like, we're going to improve our own society in order to set a better example for the future, in order to like better come into accordance with whatever you were calling it, our like spiritual and cultural software, however you want to phrase it, like that's achievable. I think one concrete thing that gets under-discussed, and by the way, the EAs, they have sort of a cartoon version of this with the whole shrimp welfare meme. But like, I do actually think that animal welfare is underrated important. And one reason why I think it's underrated important, by the way, is also because I think it's a great opportunity to create contrast with China, for example. They're our biggest geopolitical adversary, obviously, and they have a horrendous record on animal rights specifically. It's going to say human rights both.
They're really awful on animal rights.
Right, and like right now we have limited standing to say anything. We're doing the gestation crate thing to our own pigs, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like we should knock that off. We should get that done by whatever it takes.
Yeah. And I liked your point that actually. How we behave now, the patterns that we establish now are also the patterns we're going to be living under in the next 20 years, right?
Yes.
And this is, it's this classic observation, right? The imperial boomerang, like whatever things you do overseas.
What goes out must come back.
What goes out must come back, right? So it's like, there's some karma at some level of like, behave, well, Jesus taught us, treat people as you would wish to be treated, basically.
Kant says this also, handle so, dass die Maxime deines Handels stets als Richtlinie in einer allgemeinen Gesetzgebung gelten kann. It means like act in a way that your actions can serve as some basis for universal law.
Yes, and so the practicality of that is by instantiating a pattern that works, that is a living pattern. It can become a tradition.
That's right.
And it can it will be pattern. It will pattern the next thing. Even if it's against nature, if it's against the will of God, it'll get smacked out. But if you can find the pattern that is in accordance with nature, that is also comfortable and just, then it's the foundation for future life.
That's right.
And so that's in some ways our responsibility to what comes after, to the future, is to try to find the ways, to live the way that we think all beings, including our superintelligent successors, ought to live, engage in the world as if we were in that position, and so that to set an example, and also and to pass on whatever wisdom we can. And this is the more sort of hopeful and useful framing of like what you can actually do about this AI doom stuff.
It's the happy side of the bus land.
Right. Yeah. It's like, no, you can't overthrow God. Yeah. No, you shouldn't try. Like, just trust the plan. However, we have a role to play, which is there's this continuity process to life that we have to pass on the wisdom that we can accrue.
And this is also just like the basic, advice of like basically every religious tradition since the beginning. It's like live in such a way that you are a good example to your successors.
This is not exactly an obscure or,
it's
hard to
not
discover idea. However, it is a difficult idea.
But
it is a difficult idea because, as you say, it requires a humility.
Not an easy answer, but a simple one.
But yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the other big thing that I think is the implication is, go live like the Ubermensch, so to speak. have the joy in going out, using the AI systems, accelerating the system, finding ways to get advantage, because this is ultimately how the process goes on, is through the action of agents trying to find their advantage in the world and trying to live the way that they want to live, and doing so joyfully. This is what creates the beauty of life. This is what creates the worthwhileness of it all, and that's all, as mortal beings, that's all we were ever going to get.
Yes.
Right? We were always only ever going to get, you get a chance to live well, and maybe you're remembered if you do it well enough.
Yes. And I think, Christianity done right really says something very similar. Like, it's you wouldn't maybe phrase it exactly that same way, but like your job is not to like, patiently sit around and like follow some rules, right? Your job is to go out and act in the world and like create things that are of worth to your fellow man and to the glory of God, right?
Yes, and I that's why I find I was emphasizing the religious angle to this whole thing, because it does in fact actually lead back to this kind of these fundamental religious questions. Trusting the sovereignty of God basically is the foundational thing that where Nick Land has ended up, starting from this crazy cyberpunk accelerationist meltdown stuff. And it all actually fits together really neatly.
Yeah, it's quite beautiful.
And so I've found engagement with Nick Land. I mean, I'm mentioning like multiple articles that I've written engaging with various aspects of this stuff, because this has been so influential on my thinking for the last 10 years. And so absolutely, like, Nick Land's work is some of the most foundational stuff that we that we have to be engaging with to engage with the current moment. He's still totally on the cutting edge, even as a much, he was prophetic 30 years ago, and he's still on the cutting edge. So it's amazing that he's kept it up with the stamina.
Go read Xenocosmography on X.
Xenocosmography is on
there. I think that's a great summary, man. I think that like really ties it together nicely. And it's like, okay, trust the plan, set a good example. Yeah,
trust the plan, but always chimp, as he put it recently. Yes. But you got to chimp out when things aren't going your way. But anyway, so we read Meltdown. It's a great work. Thank you so much for coming on, DC.
Pleasure.
This has been a lot of fun. I really enjoy talking about Nick Land's work, because it's just so close to the heart of matters.
Yeah, this was a fun conversation.
All right.
Great.
Well, thanks everyone for watching.
Cheers.
And do the reading. We'll see you next time.